There's a very profound distortion of African history. Almost all of the books that have been written on Africa have been studies of primitives, of people in small communities just barely scratching the soil, people in jungles, etc. There is no appreciation of the fact that after the conquest, or just around the time of the conquest and after, you have a tremendous breaking up of African societies. It's not just a question of tearing these people out of their country, throwing them across the Atlantic as slaves, but the smashing of many things. It's as if you had dropped several hydrogen bombs on Africa. So that what you see afterwards is just the remnants, the ruins of the worst in Africa.
The history of the black man is too often said to have begun in chains. That's how it's taught in schools, shown in films, and repeated in the official accounts that pass for history lessons. In those narratives, Africans first appear as captives, crammed into ships, nameless, stripped, voiceless. But that version is actually a lie by omission. It erases the civilizations that flourished long before colonizers learned how to sail beyond their own shores. When conquest and slavery came, not only did they take people from Africa, but they also shattered kingdoms, broke apart systems of knowledge, and left societies in pieces. A continent was forced into ruins. And what the rest of the world was later shown were only fragments of a thriving civilization, the scattered remnants, while the truth of Africa's greatness was buried beneath propaganda.
So Columbus is the first man to give historical witness and evidence of Africans in America before him. In his journals, in his letters, you have evidence of this.
Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, a Guyanese scholar, shattered the dominance of the white academic world with his book, They Came Before Columbus. In it, he revealed that Africans had long been thriving in their own lands well before Columbus ever set sail. They were also not confined to their continent and had been voyaging far beyond, reaching the Americas long before Europeans claimed discovery. But what does all of this mean? It means our history, our culture, our very being was deliberately sabotaged. The anger and confusion you may feel when you recognize this foul play is justified, because the theft did not only strip away land, resources, and people, it stripped away memory itself. And so we begin this video not with chains, but with an open mind to learn wholeheartedly about the hidden history of the things you never knew black people had achieved before colonization. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any more truths about the legacies they never wanted you to know. Now let's begin.
When we go back to European history, European heritage, we always go back to its great heroes, its magnificent achievements. But when we go back into Africa, historians and anthropologists have always looked for the worst. When in fact you begin to study African history seriously, and recent archaeological discoveries have now thrown up remarkable things.
When people speak of kingdoms in history, they often talk about Rome, Greece, or England, but they neglect to tell the stories of Mali, Ghana, Songhai, kingdoms that commanded wealth, trade, and intellect at levels Europe could barely even comprehend. Looking at our declining world and the struggle many of our brothers and sisters face every day, it's quite interesting to think that our ancestors were once rulers of empires so wealthy that European kings trembled with envy. Yes, that was the status of West Africa long before the first slave ship touched its shores. The ancient Ghana Empire, which existed centuries before Columbus or Vasco da Gama, was not the small Ghana you see on a map today. This was a kingdom stretching across vast lands, commanding trade routes of gold and salt. Its rulers lived in splendor, their courts filled with ministers and judges, their armies powerful enough to control commerce across the Sahara. Arab historians of the time described its riches with awe, noting that dogs in the royal court wore collars made of gold. Dogs, imagine that. While peasants in Europe starved through harsh winters, the rulers of Ghana displayed wealth so casually that even their animals glittered. Then came Mali, an empire so great it sounds like a legend. You may have heard of Mansa Musa, often reduced to the simple title of the richest man who ever lived. But that phrase alone does not capture the full scale of his reign. Mansa Musa ruled Mali in the 14th century, and his empire produced half of the world's gold at that time. Let that sink in. half of the global supply. When he set out on his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought so much gold with him that the cities along his route couldn't handle it. He gave out massive amounts of gold to the poor, to merchants, and to rulers as gifts. But his generosity backfired. So much gold entered circulation that prices in places like Cairo, Damascus, and even Mecca shot up overnight. The sudden flood of wealth caused years of inflation, breaking entire markets. Yet Mansa Musa didn't just spend, he built. As rich as he was, Mansa Musa knew wealth alone wasn't enough. Gold could be spent and lost, but knowledge would last for generations. That's why he invested in education, building schools and libraries that turned Timbuktu into one of the most famous centers of learning in the world. Yes, Timbuktu was not some dusty village in the desert, as colonizers later painted it out to be. It was a city of scholars. By the 15th and 16th centuries, it hosted one of the largest universities in the world, with tens of thousands of manuscripts covering law, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Students came from across Africa and beyond, studying in institutions like the University of Sankore. This was education at a time when most of Europe was still clawing its way out of ignorance, where literacy was reserved for a priesthood and books were chained to tables because they were so rare. In Timbuktu, books were traded like treasure, more valuable than gold. After all, what good is gold without the wisdom to use it? Now, here's where the lie of history stings even deeper. Europe often takes credit for the origins of science and medicine, but it was Africans who had developed advanced healing, engineering, and technology centuries before colonial contact. Take medicine, for example. Across West and East Africa, healers developed detailed pharmacological knowledge rooted in both plants and minerals. They understood antiseptics, anesthetics, and even forms of vaccination. Centuries before Edward Jenner claimed fame for the smallpox vaccine, African healers in places like Sudan and West Africa practiced a technique called variolation, introducing small doses of the virus to build immunity. Enslaved Africans carried this knowledge to the Americas, where Cotton Mather, a Puritan minister, learned of it from an African man named Onesimus. Yet history credits the breakthrough to Europeans while erasing the very people who brought the knowledge. In the heart of East Africa, the Kingdom of Nubia, which thrived alongside ancient Egypt, was performing surgeries and crafting prosthetics thousands of years ago. Archaeologists discovered skulls in Nubia with signs of successful trepanation, the practice of drilling into the skull to relieve pressure from injuries. Some patients survived the procedure, a testament to skill and medical understanding. And in the Nile Valley, Egyptians, Africans, documented medical procedures in texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which describe diagnostics and treatments for wounds, fractures, and even neurological conditions. Technology flourished as well. Long before colonizers arrived with their cannons and compasses, Africans were charting the stars and mastering metallurgy.
2 years ago, they found that Africans were involved in the most complex astronomy, that they had plotted a whole star system. This is in Kenya, at Namorotunga. They found among the Dogon in West Africa that Africans had plotted an invisible star 700 years before it was discovered by European astronomers in the 20th century, and that the plotting of the orbit and trajectory of this star, which is a white dwarf, an invisible star, Sirius B, the trajectory and plotting, the plotting of the orbits and trajectories are as accurate as that done by satellites in the 20th century.
The Dogon people of Mali possessed astonishing astronomical knowledge. They understood the orbit of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye, centuries before Western telescopes confirmed it. Western scholars outright dismissed this knowledge as myth, sneering at the idea that primitive Africans could know truths European science had not yet caught up to. Well, that arrogance was nothing but envy and racism, and it remains a wound that still burns to this day.
When in fact you begin to study African history seriously, and recent archaeological discoveries have now throwing up remarkable things. They found within recent years, for example, that the Africans were producing steel in Tanzania, East Africa, 1,500 years before the Europeans. That they had not only entered the age of iron, before Europe, but they had jumped into the age of steel.
Yes, ironworking too was not imported to Africa. No, it was perfected there. The Nok culture of Nigeria, as early as 1000 BCE, produced advanced iron tools and terracotta sculptures of remarkable artistry. Iron smelting spread across the continent, fueling agricultural development, military strength, and architectural innovation. Clearly, this was not a people in need of saving. They were already creating civilization long before Europe learned to claim the word. Even navigation carried Africa's signature. The great voyages of the Malian fleet, recorded by Arab historians, tell of Emperor Abu Bakr II, who launched expeditions across the Atlantic nearly 2 centuries before Columbus. Dr. Ivan van Sertima and other scholars have pointed to multiple strands of evidence. For instance, Columbus himself recorded that the indigenous people of Hispaniola told him of black men who had come trading in gold-tipped spears. When samples of those spears were tested in Spain, they were found to contain the same gold, silver, and copper alloy typical of West African metallurgy. Archaeologists have noted striking similarities between the colossal Olmec stone heads of Mexico, broad-nosed, full-lipped features crowned with helmet-like headgear, and African physiognomy of the Nubian period. Botanical studies have also shown that plants of African origin, such as the bottle gourd and cotton varieties, were present in the Americas in pre-Columbian times, hinting at human transfer across the Atlantic. Oral traditions from both Africa and the Americas preserve stories of seafarers and visitors who came from across the ocean. Taken together, these traces suggest that Africans reached the Americas carrying cultural and agricultural knowledge that influenced indigenous societies. And whether skeptics admit it or not, this information overturns much of what most people were taught about who first discovered the New World.
And therefore you begin to be aware that colonization, the conquest of Europe, didn't drag people up. It actually smashed things that were happening there. Now these things are coming out of the earth because archaeology is beginning to recover these things. The capacity of the African, the potential of the African has been reduced in our imagination and our consciousness by these studies of primitives, that we do not realize that the African was involved in things that are just as important, just as significant, and in some areas even more significant than what was happening in Europe before the Industrial Revolution.
Simply put, our African ancestors were thinkers and doers. They studied the body, the heavens, the earth, and the seas. They tested, refined, and passed knowledge across generations. But colonizers could not stomach the image of a continent filled with scientists and healers apart from theirs. To justify slavery and conquest, they had to paint Africa as empty, chaotic, and unknowing. And so libraries burned, scholars silenced, and knowledge stolen. Yet, the fragments that survive tell a story too powerful to be buried. And as we move from the healers and innovators, the question lingers. If Africa had knowledge that rivaled, and in many cases surpassed Europe, how did the rest of the world benefit from it? To answer that, we need to step into the history of African trade networks, where wealth and wisdom crossed oceans and deserts. The wealth of Africa was never locked within its borders. Gold, ivory, salt, textiles, and knowledge moved across deserts, rivers, and seas. To imagine Africa as isolated is to erase centuries of movement, commerce, and exchange. These trade networks did more than fill treasuries. They connected Africa to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Asia long before colonizers set foot on its shores. The trans-Saharan trade routes were arteries of commerce stretching thousands of miles. Caravans of camels, sometimes numbering in the thousands, carried salt from the mines of Tagaza southward, where it was traded for gold, cola nuts, and enslaved captives. But salt and gold were not the only goods exchanged. Ideas traveled too. Islam spread into West Africa along these routes, bringing with it new systems of law, writing, and scholarship. Mosques rose in cities like Gao and Timbuktu, not as foreign impositions, but as symbols of African leaders engaging the wider world on their own terms. Along the Swahili coast of East Africa, vibrant city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar became centers of Indian Ocean trade. From these ports, African merchants traded gold from the Zimbabwean plateau, ivory, spices, and even enslaved laborers in exchange for Persian silks, Chinese porcelain, and Indian cotton. Archaeological evidence proves this. Shards of Chinese pottery and Persian glass still lie buried in the ruins of Kilwa. These were not backwaters but cosmopolitan cities buzzing with multiple languages, currencies, and faiths. Imagine the sight of a marketplace where African traders bargained with Arab merchants, Indian sailors, and Chinese envoys. That is the Africa they did not want you to know. Then there was Great Zimbabwe, the medieval city whose massive stone enclosures and towers still stand as evidence of African engineering brilliance. Rising in the 11th century, Great Zimbabwe controlled trade routes that funneled gold and cattle to the coast. Portuguese travelers in the 16th century, when they finally arrived, could not believe Africans had built it themselves. They invented myths of foreign builders because they could not accept that black Africans had constructed monumental architecture rivaling Europe's castles and fortresses. The ruins remain today, silent proof of a lie exposed. African trade even reached Europe directly. Long before the Portuguese voyages of the 15th century, gold from West Africa flowed into European markets through North African intermediaries. This gold financed monarchies, wars, and the early stirrings of the European Renaissance. In other words, Europe's rebirth was funded in part by African wealth. Yet in the retelling, Africa is cast as a passive supplier, never acknowledged as an active force shaping global economies. The bitter truth is that these trade networks made Africa indispensable to the world economy. But the very riches and openness that allowed Africa to connect globally also made it a target. European explorers did not stumble upon Africa by accident. They came because they already knew of its wealth. The trade routes, the ports, the caravans all signaled opportunity. When colonizers arrived, they did not bring civilization. They came to hijack systems that had already been thriving for centuries. So whenever you hear the old claim that Africa had no history until Europeans arrived, remember this. African goods sat in European treasuries. African gold financed global empires, and African cities stood as crossroads of the world. And yet the story is always told as though Africa was waiting to be discovered. The audacity is beyond words. Now, with wealth and trade networks laid bare, we must move to another dimension of Africa's story, the cultural and artistic achievements that carried memory, spirituality, and identity through centuries of both triumph and trauma. Trade and wealth may have drawn the eyes of outsiders, but the soul of Africa was written in its culture. Colonizers worked hard to dismiss African art, music, and spiritual systems as primitive. Yet what they mocked, they also looted. Entire museums in Europe today are filled with African artifacts stolen during conquest. Why? Because even those who claimed superiority knew the artistry was extraordinary. They stole what they could not replicate. Take the Benin Kingdom in present-day Nigeria. Its bronze and ivory sculptures stunned Europeans when they first saw them in the 15th century. The detail, the realism, the mastery of metal casting, all of it defied the notion that Africa lacked sophistication. The Benin bronzes depicted kings, warriors, and rituals with a precision that rivaled anything in Renaissance Europe. In 1897, when the British invaded Benin, they did not just burn the city, they carried thousands of bronzes back to England. Today, those works sit in the British Museum and other Western institutions, celebrated as masterpieces, while the descendants of their creators fight to have them returned. History stolen in plain sight. But while bronzes showed Africa's mastery in metal, music showed mastery in spirit. Yes, music too carried Africa's genius. The rhythms and patterns of African music were never just for entertainment. They carried community, served as communication, and tied people to their spirituality. Instruments like the kora, a 21-string harp lute, and the djembe drum created traditions so powerful that they became the foundation of countless global genres. These sounds held meaning. They marked rituals, guided ceremonies, and passed down history. To play and to sing was to remember. When enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic, they carried those rhythms within them, even when stripped of almost everything else. In fields, in churches, and in secret gatherings, music became both a refuge and a weapon. The sorrow of spirituals, the resilience of blues, the freedom of jazz, the fire of reggae, the praise of gospel, and the voice of hip-hop all trace back to African roots. Every beat, Every note became a way of keeping alive what slavery tried to erase. Colonizers tried to ban drums, outlaw gatherings, and silence voices, fearing the power within the music. But the rhythm always returned, reshaping itself into new forms across centuries. It became a language no whip could silence, no law could erase. And through it, Africa lived on, heard in every corner of the modern world. Language and oral tradition formed another pillar of identity. In societies where writing was less common, griots, oral historians, preserved genealogies, laws, and cultural memory through spoken word and song. Quite literally, they were the living archives of African history. So when Europeans burned manuscripts in Timbuktu and erased records during conquest, oral tradition kept memory alive. Even today, griots in Mali and Senegal can trace centuries of lineage with a precision that would humble any European historian armed with a library. But words and stories were only one way memory survived. Belief and faith carried just as much weight. Where griots guarded history through song and speech, spirituality gave entire communities the strength to endure. African religions were rooted in harmony with nature, reverence for ancestors, and balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. And seeing that these practices were grounded and well established, it is clear they were never the chaotic superstition colonizers claimed. They were complex cosmologies guiding moral, social, and political life. Even under the brutal suppression of slavery and colonization, African spiritual systems adapted, survived, and eventually blended with Christianity in the Americas to form traditions like Vodou in Haiti and Candomblé in Brazil. Art, music, story, and spirituality gave Black people identity when colonizers tried to strip them of names, languages, and gods. And perhaps that is why colonizers worked so hard to steal them, to display them in their own halls of power while teaching the world that Africa created nothing. By now, you see the pattern. Empires built, sciences advanced, trade routes thriving, art that shook the world. Yet when colonizers finally arrived, none of this was what they taught us. They did not want you to know that Africa had history because history makes people human. And if Africans were acknowledged as human, builders, thinkers, rulers, it would have been impossible to justify the horrors that followed. So colonization did not only seize land, gold, and bodies, it waged war on memory itself. This war was ruthless. In West Africa, libraries in Timbuktu were burned, thousands of manuscripts destroyed, oral historians were silenced, their stories branded as myth. In Zimbabwe, Europeans spread lies that the Great Stone Walls must have been built by outsiders, because to admit Africans had raised such monuments would shatter the myth of white superiority. Across the continent, artifacts were stolen and shipped to Europe, where they still sit locked in glass cases. Such audacity to steal someone's culture, then charge them admission to see it. Colonial schools hammered the same lie into every generation. Children were told Africa was a land without civilization, without knowledge, without contribution to the world. They were told their ancestors were savages waiting to be saved. It was all according to plan. People who believe they come from nothing will accept almost anything. Strip them of their pride, and you strip them of their power. That was the weapon colonizers used long after the guns fell silent. Even today, in modern times, this ugly war on truth continues. Museums refuse to return artifacts. Textbooks in the West reduce Africa to slavery and famine, skipping centuries of empire and innovation. Scholars who challenged this, like Dr. Ivan van Sertima, were ridiculed, dismissed, and attacked, not because their evidence was weak, but because their conclusions shattered the narrative that Western superiority depended on. If Africans sailed to the Americas before Columbus, if Africans mastered medicine before Europe, if Africans built empires wealthier than any in Europe's history, then the entire structure of colonial mythology collapses. And that collapse terrifies those who still cling to power. But here is the truth they could not bury. The achievements of Black people before colonization are not myths. They are facts carved into stone, preserved in manuscripts, sung through generations. They stand as proof that the story you were given was a deliberate lie. And when you know this, the shame is no longer yours. It belongs to those who erased, who stole, who claimed greatness by tearing others down. What was taken can never be fully restored. Too many books burned, too many voices silenced. But what survives is enough to reclaim dignity, enough to remind every black child that their history does not begin in chains, enough to remind the world that Africa was never waiting for discovery. It was thriving, teaching, creating, and influencing long before Europe knew how to look beyond its own horizon. And so the task now is not only to uncover what was hidden, but to guard it. Because the theft of memory was never just about the past, it was about control of the present and future. To break that control, you must know what was stolen, you must speak it, and you must never let them bury it again. The truth is here, in ruins that still stand, in manuscripts still being studied, in oral traditions still alive, in artifacts still glowing behind stolen glass. The truth is in the undeniable fact that Africa was not only part of history, it helped mold the world long before colonizers arrived. The tragedy is not that Africa had no history, the tragedy is that its history was stolen. And the responsibility now is to reclaim it, speak it, and guard it. See, this is why remembering matters. Because when you know that your ancestors were kings and scholars, builders and healers, you carry yourself differently. You see through the lies meant to chain you. You understand that oppression was not destiny, but an interruption. And an interrupted story can always be continued. Thank you for watching until the end of this powerful history. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like, hit the subscribe button, and turn on notifications to stand with us as we bring back the valuable truths that have long been buried. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in our next discussion.